The goats were the only thing Rena Foley took with her when she left, and she took them because they were the only thing the creditors did not want. The farm was gone, seized by the bank in Harrisonburg for the $80 mortgage that her husband Calvin had signed in the spring and died before autumn could collect, the pneumonia taking him in 6 days flat, the bank taking the farm in 10. The house went with the farm. The plow and the harness and the 2 draft horses went to the equipment dealer who held a lien. The household goods, the table, the chairs, the bed frame, the iron pots, went to the estate sale that raised $41 toward the debt and left $39 outstanding that the bank wrote off as uncollectible because the widow had nothing else to seize, except the goats. 5 Toggenburg dairy goats, 4 does and a buck, that Calvin had bought from a Swiss farmer in Page County the previous spring, and that the bank's assessor had valued at $2 each, a price so low that the cost of feeding them during the sale period exceeded their worth. The assessor told Rena she could keep them. He said it the way a man says you can keep the ashes after the house burns down, as a courtesy so thin it was almost an insult. Rena took the goats. She walked them south along the Valley Pike on a cool October morning in 1884. 5 animals on rope leads and a woman at the front of the line carrying a canvas sack that held a change of clothes, a sewing kit, a Bible, a cheese mold, and $4.60. She was 24 years old, 5 feet 6 inches, long-limbed and lean with the kind of rangy build that looked fragile until you watched her work. She had light brown hair that she wore loose to her shoulders because she had lost her last 2 hairpins during the estate sale and could not afford to replace them, gray eyes that were the color of creek water over limestone, a narrow face with a straight nose and a mouth that pressed into a line when she was thinking and softened when she was not, and hands that were rough and red from milking, the knuckles swollen, the nails cracked, the fingers permanently curved from years of gripping teats at dawn and dusk. She walked 12 miles south and then turned west into the foothills of the Alleghenies, following a track that a peddler on the Valley Pike had told her about. A hollow in the mountains where the land was unclaimed because it was too steep for plowing and too remote for anyone who had options or ambition or a reason to stay connected to the world below. The hollow was called Dunkard Run, named for a family of German Baptist settlers who had lived there a generation ago and moved on, and it opened west into the mountains through a narrow gap between 2 limestone ridges, the creek at the bottom, running clear over flat stones, the slopes forested with oak and hickory and chestnut, the ridges rising 500 feet above the creek bed on both sides. She found the spot on the second day, a south-facing slope above the creek, where a natural bench of level ground extended 30 feet into the hillside, backed by a limestone outcrop that rose 15 feet above the bench like a wall. The bench was flat, dry, and sheltered from the north wind by the ridge above and from the east wind by the outcrop. It was a natural homestead site, the kind of place that mountain people read the way literate people read books, seeing in the slope and the stone and the exposure and the water a sentence that said, "Build here." She built a small cabin on the bench, a one-room structure of chinked logs with a stone chimney, the kind of cabin that a determined person could raise in 2 weeks with borrowed tools and found timber. But the cabin was for her. The goats needed something else. The goats needed a barn. Every farmer in the Allegheny foothills kept livestock in above-ground shelters, frame barns, pole sheds, lean-tos of split rails covered with shingles or bark. These structures kept rain off the animals and wind off their backs and were considered adequate because they had always been adequate and because no one had thought to ask whether adequate was good enough. The barns were cold in winter, often within 10 degrees of the outside temperature, and hot in summer, and damp in the between seasons when rain drove horizontally through every gap in the siding. Goats, which are more susceptible to respiratory illness than cattle or horses, sickened in these barns with a regularity that farmers accepted the way they accepted weather, as a cost of doing business that could be endured but not avoided. Rena did not build an above-ground barn. She built into the hillside. If you want to know what a widow with 5 goats built underground that kept her animals alive when a storm killed every other herd in the hollow, subscribe to The Warm Floor and tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. The limestone outcrop behind the cabin bench was the key. The outcrop was not solid. It was layered limestone, the strata tilted at a slight angle from horizontal, with a softer layer of shale sandwiched between 2 harder limestone layers, approximately 4 feet above the bench level. The shale was crumbly and loose, easy to dig, easy to remove, while the limestone above and below it was solid and self-supporting. The shale layer was 3 feet thick, and it extended into the hillside for an unknown distance beneath the hard limestone cap. Rena dug into the shale. She used a pick, a shovel, and a wheelbarrow borrowed from a farmer 2 miles down the hollow, and she dug for 3 weeks, excavating the soft shale from between the limestone layers and hauling it out in loads that she dumped on the bench in front of the excavation. She dug a chamber 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep, and 6 feet tall. The floor was the lower limestone layer. The ceiling was the upper limestone layer. And the walls were a combination of natural limestone on the sides and the shale face at the back, which she shored with dry stack stone to prevent crumbling. The chamber was a natural barn. The limestone floor was flat, hard, and impervious to moisture. Goat urine drained to the front of the chamber and out through a shallow channel Rena cut in the floor, keeping the interior dry. The limestone ceiling was solid and uncracked, supporting the weight of the hillside above without any timber framing. The temperature inside the chamber was a constant 50 degrees year-round, the same stable temperature that the earth maintained at this depth, unaffected by the summer heat or winter cold that tortured above-ground barns. 50 degrees was perfect for goats. Goats are comfortable between 40 and 65 degrees. Below 40, they burn calories to stay warm and their milk production drops. Above 65, they pant and stress and their milk production drops. 50 degrees was the center of the comfort zone, the temperature at which goats ate less, stressed less, produced more, and stayed healthier than at any other temperature. And 50 degrees was what the earth provided, free, constant, and without the wood consumption that heated above-ground barns required. The front wall was the only construction. Rena built a dry stack limestone wall across the 12-foot wide chamber entrance, 4 feet high, with a 3-foot doorway at one end covered by a heavy canvas flap. Above the wall, the remaining 2 feet of the entrance opening was left open for ventilation, fresh air entering through this gap, and stale air exiting through a natural crack in the limestone ceiling at the back of the chamber that served as a vent shaft, creating a slow, continuous airflow that kept the air fresh without creating the drafts that caused respiratory illness. The goats moved in on the 1st of November. 5 Toggenburgs, 4 does and a buck, walking through the canvas door into a stone room that was dry, windproof, and 10 degrees warmer than the outside air. Within a week, they had settled into the space the way goats settle into any space that meets their needs. By making it entirely their own, sleeping against the warm limestone walls, standing on the raised stone platforms that Rena built along the sides for bedding areas, and producing milk with a consistency that surprised Rena herself. The milking happened in the barn. Rena set up a milking stand at the front of the chamber near the entrance where the light was best, and she milked twice daily, dawn and dusk, in a space that was warm enough that her fingers did not stiffen, and the milk did not chill before she could carry it to the cabin. The milk from goats kept at 50 degrees was richer than the milk from goats kept in cold barns, because the animals were not burning body fat to maintain warmth, and the calories that would have gone to heat were going instead into butter fat and protein. Rena's Toggenburgs produced an average of 3 quarts per doe per day through the first winter, a yield that exceeded the average for the breed by nearly a quarter. She began making cheese. The underground barn's constant temperature was ideal for aging. The chamber maintained the cool, humid conditions that cheese requires for proper development, and Rena hung her cheese wheels from the limestone ceiling in the back of the barn where the temperature was coolest and the air circulation was gentlest. The cheese aged slowly, developing a firm texture and a clean, tangy flavor that was better than anything the valley dairies produced in their temperature-fluctuating spring houses. By February, she was selling cheese at the store in the Gap, small wheels wrapped in cheesecloth, aged 6 weeks in the underground chamber, firm enough to slice and mild enough to eat plain. The storekeeper paid her 15 cents a pound, which was 5 cents more than the valley price, because the cheese was consistently good in a way that valley cheese was not. Valley cheese was made in spring houses where the temperature swung 20 degrees between morning and evening, producing uneven aging that left some wheels too soft and others too dry. Rena's cheese aged at 50 degrees, always, and the result was a product so reliable that the storekeeper began setting aside orders before the wheels arrived. The money changed everything. 15 cents a pound for cheese, 8 cents a quart for milk, and the occasional sale of a kid in spring. The underground barn was generating more income from 5 goats than Calvin's entire 40-acre farm had generated from grain and vegetables. The goats ate brush and brambles from the hillside, required no purchased feed, and produced year-round in the constant temperature of their stone chamber, while above-ground herds dropped production every winter when the cold forced their bodies to choose between milk and warmth. By the end of the first winter, Rena had paid off the $39 of outstanding debt to the Harrisonburg Bank. She paid it in person, walking 12 miles to the bank with an envelope of coins and small bills earned from cheese and milk, and she set the envelope on the assessor's desk. The same man who had told her she could keep the goats, and she said, "The goats paid it, every cent." If this story has touched your heart, take a moment to share it and subscribe to The Warm Floor, because stories like these deserve to be remembered. The Hollow learned about the underground barn the way mountain hollows learn about everything, through the men who rode past and the women who talked at the creek. By January of 1885, the general assessment in Dunkard Run was that the Foley widow was either clever or crazy, and that the distinction would be determined by whether her goats survived the winter or smothered in a cave. The assessment was delivered most forcefully by Yancey Creel, who farmed 80 acres at the mouth of the hollow, and who kept 12 goats in a pole barn that he considered the standard against which all goat housing should be measured. Yancey was a large man, 6'2", 220 pounds, with a red face, a black beard, and opinions that he delivered with a volume proportional to his certainty, which was always maximum. "You cannot keep goats underground," Yancey said at the store in the Gap. "Goats need air. Goats need light. Goats need to move. She's got 5 animals in a hole in a hill, and she's going to lose every one of them to lung rot before March." Rena's goats did not get lung rot. The ventilation system, the 2-foot gap above the front wall pulling fresh air in, the ceiling crack drawing stale air out, maintained air quality that exceeded any above-ground barn in the hollow, because the airflow was continuous, gentle, and free of the dust and pollen and mold spores that plagued barns with straw-filled lofts and dirt floors. The limestone floor produced no dust. The limestone ceiling harbored no mold. The air that the goats breathed was cleaner than the air in Yancey Creel's pole barn, where the straw bedding decomposed in the damp, and the manure accumulated in the corners, and the dust rose in clouds every time an animal moved. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button right now. It is free, takes a second, and helps the warm floor reach more people who need to hear it. Now back to the story. The storm came on the 14th of March, 1885. It was not a blizzard. March in the Alleghenies brought ice, not snow. But it was something worse, a freezing rain that fell for 31 hours without interruption, coating every surface in a shell of ice that grew thicker by the hour. The ice accumulated on the trees, on the roofs, on the fences, on the barns, and the weight of it was patient and relentless, and did not stop until it had broken everything it had been asked to carry. Yancey Creel's pole barn collapsed at 2 a.m. on the second night. The ice on the roof, 3 inches thick, weighing approximately 4,000 pounds spread across the 30 by 20-foot structure, exceeded the load capacity of the pole frame, and the ridge beam snapped, and the roof fell inward in a cascade of ice and timber and screaming animals. Yancey heard it from the house, a sound like a tree falling, followed by a sound like nothing he had ever heard, which was the sound of 12 goats trapped under a collapsed roof in the dark. He saved 7. 5 were dead by the time he reached them, crushed, suffocated, broken. The 7 survivors were injured, hypothermic, and wild with pain, and he spent the rest of the night pulling them from the wreckage and carrying them one by one to the house, where Martha, his wife, cleared the kitchen and spread straw on the floor and tried to warm animals that were beyond warming because the cold had been inside them for hours before the roof fell. 2 more died by morning. Yancey lost 7 of 12 goats in a single night. The ice storm damaged or destroyed 11 barns and outbuildings in Dunkard Run, pole barns, frame sheds, lean-tos, every above-ground structure that the ice could reach and the weight could break. Rena's underground barn was untouched. The ice could not reach it. The entrance was sheltered by the limestone outcrop above, which deflected the freezing rain away from the front wall. The limestone ceiling, buried under 8 feet of earth and stone, bore no ice load at all. The temperature inside the chamber held at its constant 50 degrees, while the outside air dropped to 19 degrees, and the ice accumulated, and the barns above ground cracked and fell, and the animals inside them died. Rena milked her goats that morning at dawn, as she always did. She milked in a warm, dry stone room while the hollow outside was sheathed in ice, and the sound of cracking timber carried through the frozen air from every direction. She milked 3 quarts per doe, 12 quarts total, the same yield as every other morning, because the goats had not been cold and had not been frightened, and had not spent the night listening to ice crack and timber groan above their heads. They had slept on warm stone platforms in a 50-degree room, and they had risen at dawn and walked to the milking stand and given their milk with the calm routine of animals whose world had not changed, because their world was underground, and underground nothing had changed. She made cheese. She strained the milk through cloth into the cheese mold and set it on the stone shelf where it would press and drain at 50 degrees, the same temperature that had aged every wheel before it. She carried the remaining milk to the cabin in a covered pail, stepping carefully on the ice-glazed slope. And she did not know until Lucius Hale rode up the hollow at noon that anything had happened at all. "Yancey lost 7 goats," Lucius said. "Barn came down in the ice. He's asking if you've got milk to spare." Rena had milk to spare. She had cheese to spare. She loaded a pail of milk and 2 wheels of aged cheese onto Lucius's mule and sent them down the hollow to Yancey Creel, who received them in his wrecked barnyard, standing in the ice, holding a pail of milk from goats that had slept warm and dry in a stone room underground, while his own animals died under a roof that was supposed to protect them. Yancey came to the underground barn in April, after the ice melted and the hollow began to rebuild. He stood at the entrance and looked at the stone chamber, the limestone floor, the limestone ceiling, the 5 healthy goats lying on their stone platforms chewing cud with the absolute contentment of animals that had never been cold and never been wet and never heard the sound of a roof coming down in the dark. He looked at the milking stand and the cheese wheels hanging from the ceiling and the shallow drainage channel that kept the floor dry and the 2-foot ventilation gap that kept the air clean. "I told every man in this hollow you'd lose these goats to lung rot," Yancey said. "I heard," Rena said. "I was wrong." "You were," Rena said. "Would you like some cheese?" Thank you for watching this story on the warm floor. If it reminded you that the safest barn is the one the storm cannot reach, please share it. Subscribe for more stories from the frontier and tell us in the comments, what would you have built? By the autumn of 1885, 3 farmers in Dunkard Run had begun excavating underground shelters for their livestock, 2 for goats and 1 for sheep, following Rena's method of digging into soft shale layers between harder limestone strata. The principle was simple, and it was old, older than barns, older than farming, older than the mountains themselves. The earth is constant. The earth does not freeze in winter or bake in summer. The earth does not collapse under ice or blow apart in wind. The earth holds a temperature that is neither hot nor cold, but is the temperature that life requires, and any farmer who puts that constancy between his animals and the sky is giving them something that no above-ground barn, however well built, can provide. Rena lived in the hollow for 15 years. She expanded the underground barn to accommodate 12 goats, adding a second chamber beside the first and connecting them with an interior passage. She built a cheese aging room at the back of the original chamber where the temperature was coolest and most stable, and her aged Toggenburg cheese became known in the valley, sold at the Harrisonburg market, traded at stores in a dozen mountain communities, prized for a quality that came not from any secret recipe, but from the constant cool of a stone room that the earth kept at 50 degrees while the world above it burned and froze and burned again. Settle back, listen carefully, and journey with us through the legends, hard truths, and enduring wisdom of the American frontier. Subscribe to The Warm Floor. The fire is warm. The night is still. and the frontier has much to teach.